It was a bitterly cold winter's night when Sarah Matthews was driving home from the late shift at the hospital. The snowstorm had begun to rage, blanketing the streets in a thick layer of snow that made visibility near impossible. The headlights of her car barely pierced the blizzard as she navigated the familiar road leading to her small cottage on the outskirts of town. Her mind was heavy with the weight of the day, filled with the tired faces of patients and the endless responsibilities of caring for the sick. But nothing could prepare her for what she would discover in the quiet of that stormy night. As Sarah passed the old oak tree near the edge of the forest, something caught her eye. A small bundle, tucked beneath a ragged blanket, sat just off the side of the road. Her heart skipped a beat. It was so unusual to see anything, let alone a person, on this desolate stretch of road in the middle of a storm. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as she came to a sudden halt. She hesitated for a moment, then instinct took over. Throwing her car into park, Sarah leapt out of the vehicle and hurried towards the strange sight. As she got closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a baby, an infant no more than a few weeks old, wrapped in a dirty, frozen blanket. The child's tiny body trembled, pale and lifeless in the freezing night air. Sarah's heart raced as she knelt beside the baby. She checked for signs of life, feeling for a pulse and listening intently for any breath. The child's skin was cold to the touch, and Sarah could barely contain the panic rising within her. She knew that if she didn't act fast, the baby would not survive. With shaky hands, Sarah wrapped the infant gently in her own scarf, lifting the tiny body into her arms. The baby's eyes fluttered open, weak and disoriented, but there was a spark of life still in those eyes. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had to get the baby to safety, fast. She hurried back to her car, the snow falling heavier now, and carefully placed the child in the passenger seat. As she started the engine, her thoughts raced. Who could have left this child here, alone in the storm? And why? Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but the road behind her was empty. There was no sign of anyone. The mystery of the abandoned baby was already consuming her thoughts as she drove towards the nearest hospital. As Sarah drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random act of cruelty. There was something about this moment that felt like fate, the moment she would be forever tied to this child in ways she could not yet understand. By the time Sarah arrived at the hospital, the storm had worsened. The wind howled outside as snow piled up against the doors, but inside, the emergency room was a frantic blur of activity. Nurses and doctors moved with purpose, tending to patients in various stages of crisis. But when Sarah burst through the doors with the baby in her arms, everything seemed to stop. The head nurse, Carol, immediately recognized the urgency in Sarah's eyes. "What happened?" she asked, rushing forward. "There's a baby," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Abandoned on the road." She was freezing, barely breathing. I think she was left there to die." Carol's eyes widened with shock, and she quickly ushered Sarah into one of the emergency treatment rooms. The baby, though still fragile, had warmed up slightly from the heat of Sarah's body, but it was clear she had a long way to go. The pediatrician, Dr. Mitchell, arrived within moments, examining the baby with steady hands. "She's a fighter," he murmured, checking her vitals. "Her heart rate is strong, but she's severely malnourished and dehydrated. We need to get in her as soon as possible." As they worked to stabilize the infant, Sarah stood back, helpless and unsure of what to do next. She had never imagined her night would turn into this, a desperate race against time to save a baby she didn't know, a child who seemed to have no one. The baby's tiny hand grasped Sarah's finger, and for a moment, their eyes met. The infant's gaze was full of silent plea, a question without words. Why am I here? Why was I abandoned? A wave of grief and protectiveness washed over Sarah. She had lost her own child 3 years ago, a miscarriage that had shattered her heart. The pain of that loss had never truly left her, and yet, in this baby, she felt something stir within her, a maternal instinct that she thought had died with her own child. Dr. Mitchell finished his assessment. "She's not out of the woods yet," he said gently, as Sarah's eyes lingered on the small, fragile face. "But with some care, I think she'll make it." Sarah nodded, but her heart was heavy. Who would do this to such a helpless creature? Why leave her alone in the snow? The questions weighed on her mind, but there were no answers yet. The storm outside raged on, and all she could do was stay by the baby's side. Hours passed. The hospital staff worked tirelessly to care for the infant, but it was Sarah who couldn't step away. She refused to leave the baby alone, watching over her, holding her hand when the four was administered, and whispering soothing words to calm her. By the time the storm began to subside, the baby had shown signs of improvement. Her breathing had steadied, and she was no longer as cold to the touch. She was still weak, but she was alive. And that was all that mattered to Sarah. As dawn approached, Sarah found herself alone in the quiet room with the baby, still in her arms. The pale light of early morning filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow on the child's face. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny fingers curling around Sarah's hand once more. A single tear slipped down Sarah's cheek. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. The child needed a home, a real home, and Sarah felt her heart open to the possibility of becoming her mother. She had never imagined herself taking on the responsibility of raising a child again, but this baby had found her for a reason, and Sarah was determined to care for her, no matter the cost. But before she could make any decisions, there was still one question to answer. Who was the baby's family? And why had they abandoned her in the snow? As the days passed, Sarah's bond with the baby, now named Emma, grew stronger. Emma continued to recover, her health improving steadily under the hospital's care. But the mystery of who had left her in the snow gnawed at Sarah. She couldn't shake the image of that tiny, fragile face, abandoned like a piece of forgotten trash on the side of the road. There had to be more to this story, something hidden just beneath the surface. Despite her growing attachment, Sarah knew the clock was ticking. The authorities had launched an investigation into the abandonment, and although they were doing everything they could to track down the baby's family, nothing concrete had surfaced. Sarah had spoken to the police, explaining the events of that night, but no one seemed to know who could have done such a thing. One afternoon, as Sarah sat by Emma's crib, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. It was Detective Harris, the lead investigator on the case. His face was serious, but there was a trace of something softer in his eyes when he looked at the baby. He entered the room, tipping his hat politely. "Sarah," he began, "I know this has been a difficult time for you. We've found something." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What is it? Who left her?" Harris took a deep breath, sitting across from her. "We've traced the baby's birth records. Emma's mother, her name was Laura Collins. She passed away just 2 days before we found Emma." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She had assumed that the baby's family was still out there, but this was something entirely different. "How did she die?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking slightly. Laura Collins had been living in a shelter in the city. She was struggling with addiction, and from what we can tell, she was in no condition to care for Emma. The shelter staff said she was often incoherent, and there were signs she wasn't well enough to raise a child. But they never expected her to abandon Emma like this. Sarah's mind raced. She had seen enough stories in her line of work to know how cruel the world could be, but this was different. Laura Collins had been a mother, at least at one point, but the world had been too much for her, And now Emma was left to bear the weight of that tragedy. Detective Harris continued, "We believe Emma's father may have been involved, but we haven't been able to find him. He seems to have disappeared shortly before Laura's death. There are no records of him after that." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. Emma's father had abandoned her mother and disappeared without a trace. The baby had been left to face the harsh world alone, just a tiny soul without a protector. Sarah's heart shattered for the helpless child, but as the detective spoke, something deep inside her stirred. She couldn't bear the thought of Emma growing up without a family, without someone to love her. "I'm not going to let her go," Sarah said, her voice firm with resolve. "I'll adopt her. I'll be her mother. I don't care what it takes." Detective Harris gave her a long look, a hint of respect in his eyes. "I think that's the best thing for Emma, Sarah. If you're willing to take on this responsibility, we'll do everything we can to support you." The adoption process would take time, but Sarah was undeterred. She knew her heart had already made the decision. Emma was meant to be hers. Weeks passed, and Sarah found herself navigating the legal hurdles of adopting a child, all while caring for Emma. The town rallied around her, offering support in ways she never expected. Neighbors dropped by with meals, friends helped her prepare Emma's room, and even the hospital staff checked in regularly to see how they were doing. It was clear that the whole town had witnessed the bond that had formed between Sarah and Emma, and many had become emotionally invested in the story of the abandoned baby and the woman who had stepped in to give her a chance at life. As Sarah held Emma one evening, watching the sunset from her porch, she thought about how far they had both come. Emma, once a forgotten child, was now her daughter, her little girl, with a future full of hope. And Sarah, once broken by the loss of her own child, had found healing in a way she never expected. Emma's quiet presence filled the empty spaces in her heart. As the years passed, Sarah would look back at the night she found Emma in the snow and realize that it had been the defining moment of her life. Emma was her second chance, a chance to give love, to heal, and to create a family from the broken pieces of the past. The answers to who had left Emma in the snow would remain a mystery, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. Emma was no longer alone. And neither was she. Together, they would face whatever came next as mother and daughter, bound together by a love that nothing could ever break. The end.